Thank you for being here. It's a very big honor for me. My name is Claudio Paravati. It's a very big honor to try to moderate this panel. And I want to thank you, everyone, you that are here to listen to us, and our panelists. I'm talking about Barsamian, the Pontifical Legate of the Western Europe, a representative of the Armenian Church to the Holy See. Thank you for being with us. Frate Enzo Bianchi, he's the founder of the monastic community of Bose. Thank you. And Chris Ferguson, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and Christian Krieger, president of the Council of European Churches, Ioan Sauca, general secretary of the World Councils of Churches, and we have Wei Wu, president of the China Christian Council. I say everyone? Yes, I think so. And my co-chair is Luca Ferracci. Thank you, Luca, for being with us. He's affiliated researcher of FSCIRE. So this panel is a very tough one. Why? Because we try to think about this important question. Is Christian ecumenism a model? A model for what? For the interfaith dialogue, for the interfaith cooperation, for the society, for Europe? It's a big and tough question, but we have a great person that can help us to reflect together. So maybe, Luca, you want to add something to start? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Claudio. Thank you to the other speaker. And what I would like to offer in this few minutes is some considerations of the theme and a very simple point of reflection to start our discussion at the end of the presentations. There are certainly many aspects of Christian ecumenism that can inspire interreligious dialogue, starting with the mandate of reconciliation that is based, as someone said, on the conversion of heart and the renunciation of accusing each other of heresy and false doctrines. But I would like to stimulate our discussion by trying to reverse the question and ask what the interfaith dialogue, which is far younger than the Christian desire for unity, can learn from the mistakes, if you can say, of the ecumenical movement. And I will try to briefly tackle the issue from an historical perspective. As it is well known, Christian ecumenism has different emotional and institutional epicenters and find different ways of expression since its inception. One of the main features that characterize the history of Christian ecumenism has been interaction, and in some cases the contrast between the two poles of the search for unity, orthodoxy and orthopraxis. In other words, unity by doctrine and unity by service. At the beginning of the 20th century, few would have bet that within 20 years, the emergence of the ecumenical movement, in the Genevan sense of the term, would have succeeded in bringing harmony between these two poles. In 1901, the Unitarian minister and theologian Charles William Went summarized this tendency with a definition: dogma could chain Christians together, but could never unite them. No formulary could ever contain the great topics of religion, and the solution to divisions among Christians, he held, could be achieved only by love. Indeed, Went said, even when we united in saying, I believe in God, what a diversity there was, immediately we began to define what we meant by God. What mattered more than anything else, according to Went, was an earnest heart. What Went's address amounts to is a simple statement of what White referred to as a non-dogmatic ecumenism, or ecumenism of humanity, which offers something quite different from other styles of nascent ecumenism in the early 20th century. It sought to move Christians away from their historic forms towards a more fundamental spiritual expression of unity, resting in universal love. This kind of liberal theology, as it was addressed by its detractors for its lack of any dogmatic and confessional certainty, was the most represented Christian current in the World Parliament of Religion, held in Chicago in 1893. Indeed, the idea that the essence of Christianity rests in a humanistic universalism that moves beyond any form of doctrinal Christianity perfectly matched with the goal of the World Parliament of Religion that was, I quote from the official proceedings, to bring together in conference the leading representatives of the great historic religions of the world to show how many important truths the religion have in common, and 3, to promote and deepen the spirit of human brotherhood among religious men of different faiths. In other words, the basic idea was that the great historic religions have important things in common, and that an exchange of ideas would bring this further to light and stimulate mutual understanding. This sort of comprehension entered into theology at the Enlightenment that strived to bring the specificity of each doctrinal tradition to a common denomination of universal value in time and space. The World Parliament of Religion has been a unique event, while the so-called liberal theology was literally dismissed by Karl Barth as little more than an apology of German culture. Official history wants that the origin of identifying oneself as ecumenical arose from the combination of the theological approach of faith and order with the practical one of life and work. This was the biggest success of a generation of ecumenical pioneers, prophets, and pathfinders. Indeed, tensions and divergences between the two branches of the ecumenical movement may have been latent throughout the first half of the century, but the adagio doctrine divide, service unite never prevailed on the attempt to remove misunderstandings on doctrine so that the common Christian heritage may re-emerge in full clarity and vice versa. This was the case at least until the 70s, when the balance between these two souls broke down and each seemed to lose its effectiveness. While theologians have proved themselves capable to reach an understanding on almost any question of dogma, students and social activists pointed the finger at a movement that seemed to be losing momentum. Orthopraxy and ethics took over a doctrinal ecumenism running in circle and without the capacity to affect the life and the mission of the churches. Having both orthodoxy and orthopraxy lost their specificity, it was at that moment that the term ecumenism began to be used to indicate a vague, ironic attitude in spiritual matters and ethical issues, sometimes good to express forms of friendly behaviors among popes and patriarchs, rabbis and imams, pastors and priests. So, to ask the original question, what interreligious dialogue must not imitate in Christian ecumenism? Certainly, interreligious dialogue must not lose sight of the balance between knowledge and praxis, technicality in dialogue and social concerns, just as the ecumenical movement did in its infancy and youth, if we want to follow improperly the patterns of an anthropomorphic history. Both must not be based on the reiteration of dogmatic certainties, neither fall in the trap of a self-satisfied Irenaeus, but break the ground for a new intellectual standards and more responsible social action. I thank you once again, the speaker, for their intervention, for their contribution in this session, and I'm looking forward to listen your opinion and thoughts on this, and I give the floor to Monsignor Barsamian, Pontifical Legate of the Western Europe and representative of the Armenian Church to the Holy See. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I am honored to present my humble response to the question of whether Christian ecumenism is a model. The short answer is definitely yes.
Can you hear?
Ecumenism can be regarded as a model for dialogue in the sense that Christian confessions through the centuries pass from heated theological and philosophical debates, devolved into violent clashes, and reach eventually a place of dialogue. the global ecumenical movement exemplifies the universality of the Christian faith and unity among the churches, both large and small. The universal church itself is a historical and objective reality, a real community, and not an abstract theory or an imaginary and invisible subjective construct. So too is the ecumenical enterprise. It embodies historical and specific traditions that are mutually recognized and esteemed. Here we think more about what unites us than what divides us. The modern ecumenical movement has become definitely a catalyst to create an environment of mutual respect, openness, and rapprochement among the churches, which were deeply divided theologically, culturally, historically, and geographically. The movement carefully dismantled the walls of isolation and opened the gates towards unity with dialogue, cooperation, understanding, and veneration for one another. It was through the ecumenical movement that active interaction began, as we heard, at the outset of the last century. As a servant of the Armenian Church, I would like to focus specifically on the many centuries old ecumenical spirit of the Armenian Church, which I believe has a great deal to offer on this very topic. The Armenian Christian tradition, as expressed through the centuries, is not a tradition of isolation and seclusion. It emerged and developed in association and interrelationship with, under the influence of other Christian traditions, such as the Syriac, Greek, Georgian, Latin tradition, to mention only the most prominent ones. Armenia was never and is not now an island unto itself. Armenia, from the very beginning of the Christian era, was part and parcel of the missionary, theological, liturgical, and cultural life and heritage of the early and medieval oikomene. Thus, Armenian history knows no acute division between East and West. The very origins of Armenia's Christian history and traditions were shaped by the influences emanating from Jerusalem, Antioch, Nisibis, Melitene, Caesarea in Cappadocia, Alexandria, and Byzantium. In addition, Christian life and creative culture grew very rich in Armenia during the centuries when the ecumenical dimension of the Armenian Church was the most dominant element. There are numerous aspects in Armenian church history that illustrate the ecumenical openness of the Armenian church. The traditions of the church were formed and sustained in ecumenical communication, not isolation. Its traditions, as one of the Oriental Christian church's historical experiences, have been the most open to other churches' traditions. Allow me now to present one of the most visionary Catholicoi patriarch of the Armenian Church, Nerses IV, the gracious Shnorhali, we call in Armenian, who was the Catholicos in the years 1166 to 1173. And this is the time of the Cilician era of the Armenian history. During this time, church unity became one of the core issues and a priority concern motivating the Armenian Church. The writings of Catholicos Nerses, pastoral letters, church union correspondence, and theological and doctrinal treatise demonstrate a profound spiritual outlook on Christian unity and the ecumenical spirit. The simple yet powerful words of Nerses the Gracious constitute the spirit of the Armenian ecumenism. He says, unity in essential matters, diversity in secondary matters, love over all, as we just heard also. And this is also a quotation, I believe, from St. Augustine. For Nerses, unity was not necessarily expressed by the institutional oneness of the church. Instead, unity was accomplished and realized in diversity and diversity in unity. For him, unity was an objective, God-given reality grounded in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Therefore, the unity of the church was neither an institutional nor a conceptual reality, but an essence. Christian unity was the living presence of God in Jesus Christ. Nerses stressed the basic ecclesiological principle that the Apostolic Church was the bedrock of Christian unity. He perceived the church as a fellowship, koinonia of faith, and he believed that this faith constitutes the basis and the heart of unity. For Catholicos Nerses, Christian unity was a unity of love in Christ and among the members of Christ's body, namely the church. He believed that the church is the living body of Christ, not a human-made organization. He stressed that the local churches, each possessing ecclesial fullness, constitute and form the one body of Christ. According to him, the prevailing differences among the churches, he says, could be corrected in time, little by little, through the growth of love. For him, love was a source of humility. Hence, unity was restored by the sweetest humbleness, he says, and not with royal, frightful power. Nerses insisted that unity could be achieved only with the spirit of equality and humility, not with the spirit of superiority and triumphalism. Moreover, he stressed the importance of prayer for unity. By emphasizing the importance of prayer, Nerses sought the involvement of people faithful in their common work for unity. Catholicos Nerses believed that the churches must be one in essential matters that touch the very core of Christian faith and the foundations of the church. The concept of unity in diversity and diversity in unity, which has become a significant aspect and major principle of the ecumenical vision of unity, is in full display in the his correspondences, pastoral writings, and theological dialogues. His writings can serve as a vital, important guidelines for ecumenical cooperation, church unity, and especially the spirit of tolerance, which is so urgently needed in this world, in today's world. Ecumenism apprehends that the society of the church is one. The fractious church at Corinth failed to grasp this clear teaching of the gospel, since seen particularly in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 17. In verses 22 and 23, Christ says, I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to be complete unity. The title of G20 Interfaith Gathering here in Bologna is Time to Heal, Peace Among Cultures, Understanding Between Religions. I believe that some of the historical and contemporary experiences of Christian ecumenism can definitely serve as a model, bringing different faiths and cultures for a dialogue to accomplish the process of healing and establishing peace in the world. Thank you.
We thank you, Barsamian. Unity in diversity in unity. Frate Enzo Bianchi, unità nella diversità, diversità nell'unità. L'ascoltiamo con piacere, i suoi 8 minuti.
Non è assolutamente.
It is undoubtedly hard to provide an answer to this observation, unity in diversity and vice versa. Actually, ecumenism was, still, and will be understood very differently by different churches. Is it a pathway we can follow in order to foster interreligious dialogue? Well, before answering this question, we may take into consideration its complexity. I believe we should think about the results we have reached so far. Why is that? Because actually, ecumenism was created as a unity pathway in one single faith, one single church of many different Christian confessions that for centuries have been separated and opposite one to another. They were denying reciprocally, but then an evolution occurred. For sure, there was a time in which there were dialogues and understanding. Acceptance was there, but we cannot say that nowadays ecumenism is unity in faith in one single church on behalf of all the churches. That's not true. There are indeed some churches that still think that ecumenism is still that. But nowadays, other churches, and I would say the majority of Christians nowadays, think about a plural unity of a series of churches accepting each other's and giving themselves legitimacy, even though they have different worships. But what's the regula fides right now? That's the crucial problem revolving around the unity of Christians. Nowadays, we have a cooperation among different churches when it comes to social issues, for example. We do have theological dialogues among churches, that's true, but we are so far away of unity. We are so far away from unity. Recently, we've heard that ecumenism at the moment is at a standstill. So behaving with kindness and social cooperation is right, that's sure. And theological dialogues among churches, well, the majority of them is at the standstill, I have to say, because according to some worships, differences must be accepted. German evangelic churches have followed I chose a liturgy, although the Eucharistic moment still divided us according to different disciplines. I don't know whether this pathway is something we can still follow in the future, but that's what I tried to do over my 50 years of experience. Regarding interreligious dialogue, I believe that we have a great target ahead, meaning stating that we have a brotherhood between human beings beyond those that pray God or don't pray God. Brotherhood is our pillar. Religious barriers don't have to exist. We should rather define a reality of human beings that believe in someone who is called God or has a different name. The true landscape here is brotherhood and humanity. We have to foster dialogue with all the men and women of this world, going beyond barriers and walls, thus affirming the dignity of human beings, whether they are believers or not. We have to search within religions a human touch and a spirituality. Religion can bestow us such brotherhood pathway. Our landscape, though, has to be the one of humanity, and the ecumenism pathway, in my opinion, has a meaning. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge the current reality. We are at a standstill, at a dead end, it seems. We can't find in any way a step forward. We are not able to accept differences. The idea of unity as uniformity is within us. It's not a plural reality, so we're not able to bear this weight. But without a plural unity, even within God's drawing, there's only poverty. God has many different aspects, and faith can be nourished thanks to differences. Thank you. Thank you so much, Enzo Bianchi, for giving voice to this content. Your presence is very dear to us. You live in your daily experience ecumenism, and thank you for once again talking about such an important topic, which is the standstill at which the ecumenism is at the moment. So the first question was, what about interreligious dialogue? What should we avoid? What are the mistakes we should avoid when it comes to ecumenism? So you widened up really our landscapes talking about brotherhood. Actually, this is the real landscape we have to look forward to achieving.
To Chris Ferguson of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was greatly stimulated by the question, but I want to start in a different place than either addressing the question of dialogue or the state of ecumenism or lessons to be learned. That all of these questions are only pertinent because of the context in which they emerge. And I want to start simply by saying the context in which we emerge, which we are needing to deal with, in the words of the theological work we've been doing, reading the signs of the time, is we address the question of what God is calling the world to do in a world fallen among thieves. That in this moment of the COVID pandemic, what has been clearly revealed, unveiled, and made clear is that we are in a global civilizational crisis. Before the pandemic hit, we were at the board as a human society, just at the edge of being able to see and detect the civilizational crisis as it emerged in these other life-threatening crises. The economic crisis with its widening inequality and disparity, the ecological crisis threatening and taking away the gift of biodiversity and threatening the very gift of creational life itself. We have within this then an emerging crisis around the destruction and erosion of the world order, where you have rising racism, authoritarianism, toxic nationalisms that are shaping and forming an unequal system, an inequality regime, as some economists call it, that is upheld by militarized force. And that it has as characteristics not only supremacies like white supremacies and built-in patriarchies, in the bad sense of the word, to my Orthodox brothers, decision of the dominance of male power over others. I think that we live in a context where the question is, not only is ecumenism a model, but that what is it in fact that all of humanity, and certainly all religions, are called to do to respond to this massive threat of life. That all our other religious and spiritual resources become subordinate to the question that God of life is calling us to a world of crisis, to bring us from a place where we are to a place where the whole planet and all its people can flourish and have life in abundance. So the real question as we're searching for models is models for what? It isn't models to harmonize between religious actors, and that's why I would favor, rather than focus narrowly on questions of dialogue. Dialogue is obviously an instrument in an interreligious journey of cooperation to have the whole of our communities, all of the endangered life in this planet and in God's creation, focused towards peace, justice, and a creation that lives in harmony and thrives. We see this, of course, that's the first point is focusing it is not focus narrowly on the relationship between religions, and that I think that in that understanding of the breaking up of the civilizational consensus, new things emerge. And I think all the speakers have, and I'm sure we'll continue to hear, that we will now operate not from a false idea of unity, that there's somehow one way of being human, but rather from an understanding of diversity and manyness. And that what we're seeking is the gift of unity that we have all been given, is that all of us, created in God's image, and the creation of God itself, have in its commonality that we are made for life. And that what we are seeking, therefore, is a coming together in our diversity and difference and separations that brings us to the place where life for all can flourish. I think the summary of the religious instinct is caught up in an illustration that was given by Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who, when asked about kind of the purpose of religion, used this parable saying, when God wakes up in the morning, the first thing God does is call all the company of heaven together and say, where is it in my world that needs repairing? This, in Hebrew, tikkun olam, to mend the world. We hear about healing and to bring it together. I want to just say, so the focus, I think very much, you've talked about the learnings when we began, the vice moderator. It is clear that in this sense, the idea of orthopraxis and acting in service is important, but the agenda in Christian vocabulary is prophetic and transformative. It isn't finding one static way, but understanding that the world itself is in threat, and that threat needs to be addressed, not assuming that from the places we already are, we can just get along better. I want to say a little bit in terms of one of my learnings of not only putting God's mission at the center of any dialogues or interaction, of how we're all called to address that and really keep our threatened context at the fore of all our relationships. The commonality of that is that when I hear about ecumenism failing, or that we're not in unity, I do want to lift up something that amazed me in the last number of years. And that is, there are places where ecumenism has never been worse, that the ways in which the churches are dealing with the context has never been in a poorer spot, and contributing mightily to conflict and division. And at the same time, it started with the Catholic Lutheran dialogue in the process called From Conflict to Communion, issuing the joint declaration of the doctrine on the doctrine of justification, that this is now embraced by 5 world communions, not only 2, because of this exact method that no longer talked about growth in agreement, but talked about differentiating consensus, a consensus that is actually built from differences, to get to a place where those differences lead us to understand what is at stake in the question that divides us. And so fundamentally, the doctrine of justification was understood in a way that said, although we all see it differently, we understand that it is what is sovereign in that question is that it is God that does the saving of the world, and that therefore our differences that are in fact part of our God-givenness. So I think in the interreligious cooperation, which I prefer to talking about dialogue, in the coming together with political leaders and religious leaders, in being led from the grassroots, all those places where life is threatened, we go to where life is threatened, we honor the differences. We've learned that from the ecumenical movement. And it's true, in many ways we're farther apart, but we have been left with a gift of a method that is actually the perfect method for a world fallen among thieves, differentiating consensus.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. Now I'd like to give the floor to the president who is connected with us. I ask if he's online right now.
Oh, I wonder where he was.
Yeah, it's a very pleasure to have you with us. I give you the floor and we listen to you very carefully. President Hu, he's president of the China Christian Council. Okay, we try to listen to the
it's
voice.
a great opportunity for me to be here. And it was also a great opportunity to hear other people's opinions. Ecumenism is a philosophical concept that was generated in the Hellenistic period. It emphasized that universal facts could be discovered and understood. As many other ancient Greek philosophic concepts, ecumenism also exists in the faith of Christianity. From teachings in the Bible and the development of the early churches, the concept of ecumenism could have been detected. And this concept has laid important theoretical foundations for Christianity to be transformed into a world religion from a branch of Judaism. However, ecumenism contains both affirmative and negative aspects. I think this is a point through which we may better understand today's topic. Is Christian ecumenism a model? From the ecclesiological perspective, Christianity has its universal applicability, which means Christian churches could be established in different cultures, ethnics, and societies. Churches of different ethnics and regions can be connected as the body of the Christ. From the perspective of soteriology, ecumenism refers that the salvation of Christ is meant for the entire humankind. All who trust and accept Jesus Christ as their Savior are intended to be saved. These doctrines are rooted in the biblical teachings, but also verified and developed in church practices, and have laid foundations to maintain the holiness, the unity, and the oneness of the church. And this affirmed the positive and the vital significance of ecumenism. And it brought up a world religion. Ecumenism was critical in the shaping of Christian doctrines and churches, and so was it in the mission movement starting in the 19th century. If any negation of ecumenism, that is how to balance the relationship between universality and particularity, unity and plurality. It is the key to achieve church unity. However, there will also exist the paradox. I remember that other speakers also mentioned about dialogues. I think it's very important and a very effective way to achieve plurality and oneness. However, I think Christian faith is ecumenical, yet people who have Christian faith are not all ecumenical, and we need to face this fact. God's children live in different social environment and cultural background. They have their own life experience and faith journeys, which are different gifts endowed by God. We need to learn, admit, and respect the differences. The ecumenical movement in the history had experienced many good attempts. The 1910 Edinburgh World Missionary Conference was a great example. It made advocacy for cooperation and resource sharing. It also admitted differences and avoided arguments on topics which were likely to cause conflicts, such as the doctrines, liturgies, priesthood, etc. The efforts and compromises which were made with the common goal towards common visions of mission work enabled unity of churches to some extent. Visible organizations were established, and that was not an easy scenario to be seen in the history. When we talk about church unity, I think there is a very clear statement in the Bible. The Lord Jesus reminded his disciples to pray for the unity of the church. Why in the beginning of the 20th century, there would be a big wave of ecumenical movement that brought tremendous impacts onto the whole world. I think that the common missions and the needs of church development enabled churches to make the choice voluntarily. It was the momentum for churches to strive for unity, and thus a great movement of unity with practical results and theories were formed and carried on till the day. The church in China was not an independent church in the beginning of the 20th century. However, it also joined the ecumenical movement. T.C. Chao, a well-known church leader and theologian of China, believed that ecumenism started from God's love and the love between one another. He believed that the ecumenism was based on God's love and also out of love among one another. He made advocacy of ecumenism, yet at the same time also made promotions of indigenization of the church, modernization of the society, and the peace of the world. His understanding of ecumenism, to some extent, symbolized Christians of China beautiful aspirations and seeking for church unity under the circumstances of the historical conditions and the existing contexts. Thanks to God's blessings, due to some historical opportunities, churches of China have got rid of the patterns of denominations and grew towards unity ever since 70 years ago. Today in China, the church in China is having an endeavor of the reconstruction of theological thinking. which makes the church rooted in the fine traditional culture and help Chinese Christians to make their own witnesses in the society. Meanwhile, the church in China is willing to deepen exchanges and cooperation with churches around the world on the basis of mutual respect. Today, we see that the world is under severe impacts of the COVID pandemic, and we also see disasters caused by deploying of natural environments. In addition, poverty, hunger, and wars are also threatening humans' life and safety. Therefore, the churches of Christ are to seek unity and cooperations to help people in difficulties and to bear witnesses of Christ's salvation. Thank you.
Thank you, President Wu, first of all, for joining us from a so far land and for your testimony about a small but lively community a lively Christian community in the world. I think that your contribution matches perfectly with the contribution of Monsignor Barsamian about the dialogical nature of Christianity, given the enculturation, the process of enculturation of Christianity in the past century. So now I give the floor to Christian Krieger, President of the Council of European Churches. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be there and to participate in this G20 interface. Is Christian ecumenism a model? And the first question I had is that one you shared already, for what? My first reaction when I saw the topic was a sense that the question seemed incomplete. It cannot be the purpose of this interface G20 to make a global assessment on Christian ecumenism. And what's more, in 10 minutes. Our purpose can only be to discuss the question of the applicability of Christian ecumenical methodology to another area or field. But to which one? To interreligious dialogue, to foster a spirit of unity and fellowship between religions? To one particular religion, to mitigate this internal dissension or even remove those divisions that fragment it? To states and their leaders who are primarily concerned with their own economic and geopolitical interests rather than the common good? A trend that has become even more pronounced since the abandonment of the multilateralism? To the global challenges, the urgent of climate change, the threat of biodiversity, the world hunger, economic inequalities, health, education, security, migration, you know these things. To plural societies, to heal their wounds, especially those in the Western countries often fragmented by excessive individualism, damaged by a culture of hate and violence, and the receptiveness of nationalist and populist discourse. To what? Since it is not really possible to make a global assessment of Christian ecumenism, with its success, you mentioned them, its failure and its difficulties, and since we also not have 1 century to achieve that for all these challenges I mentioned, I would like to outline 4 lessons which mutandis might be considered in relation to the field I have just mentioned. And I leave it up to you to make the relation to these fields. The first, I have 4 levels also. The first is on the ecological level. The ecumenical movement is more than a century old now. What really gave an impetus was the shake-up and the deep questioning resulting from the two tragedies of the 20th century, namely the barbarity of the First World War, a conflict between so-called Christian states, and the tragedy of the Holocaust perpetrated even by a Christian state. How was this possible? Faced with this challenging question, the Christian churches, which, with the exception of the Catholic Church, are generally national churches, became aware of the fundamental need to exist in relation to one another, to cultivate a bond of brotherhood and communion, to work towards a visible unity so that these tragedies would not come back anymore. The first point I would like to emphasize is that in engaging in ecumenical dialogue, the churches have all affirmed a deficiency. They had conceded that individually they cannot claim the truth with a high T. They have come to realize that the truth is not given exclusively to one of them, which may therefore look down on the others with arrogance or contempt, but that the truth is given in sharing, and that the way to the truth is through encounter and dialogue. Therefore, every church needs the other and needs to cultivate the relationship with the others in order to deepen its own theological and spiritual culture on the one hand, and to access to higher truths on the other. Because a respectful encounter and dialogue with otherness become the condition of ecclesial truth, the demanding debate that results from it obliges one to go beyond his particularism and to understand oneself as part of a whole, a member of the body of Christ, a part of the family of God's children. This principle of a shared truth, which has resulted of making us seen beyond our particularism, is very essential to enter in an ecumenical movement. The second, building a visible unity. I'm now on the level of the doctrine. Many theological dialogues have been conducted in order to build the full visible unity of the Church. And I would like to mention an example that has made it possible to lift the anathemas that two denominations have attributed each to one another in the past. And in doing so, to overcome a division and become reconciled in an ecclesial communion. I'm referring to the Lutheran church tradition and the Reformed church tradition. At the time of the Reformation in the 16th century, these two Protestant currents experienced a violent theological debate that permanently divided the emerging Protestantism. Although there was an agreement on 27 of 28 articles in the Confession of Augsburg. All attempts and effort made by reformers like Martin Butzer to reconcile the two currents were unsuccessful, resulting in centuries of rivalry and confessional confrontation and division. And in the 1960s, 70s, a working method was devised in order to overcome this schism. It consisted of examining and verifying if there could be a common understanding of the essentials of what constitutes the Church according to the Protestant theology, namely the preaching of the Word of God or the Gospel and the administration of the recognized sacraments, the Lord's Supper and baptism. The work of theologians succeeded in establishing a common understanding in these essential elements, and that enables the separate Lutheran Reformed traditions to come to a common understanding. On this basis, the churches were then able to incorporate these results in a common declaration, the so-called Leuenberg Agreement signed in 1973. And this declaration overcame the historical barriers, and the anathemas of the past were removed to give place for a new relationship, what we call a communion of two churches or church tradition, which is something more than just an association, a federation, a brotherhood, or whatever you mean. Indeed, through this ecclesial communion, every member of one church of those traditions could see him or herself as a true member of the other tradition. It only remained to invite the churches, the national churches, to receive and adopt this declaration. And in this way, a church communion was gradually established in Europe on the basis of the theological declaration. It is an ecumenical model for reconciliation, for communion, and one that does not demand uniformity. It is a union that does not deny diversity. It's a union through an assumed diversity. It is a model of reconciliation that assumes a dissensus that does not afford a full consensus on everything, that lifts the separateness of differences and relativizes them by focusing on a common understanding of the essential. The methodology seems to me to be of relevance, as it has made possible to overcome more than 4 centuries of conflicts. Third point, ecumenism of service, action, or cooperation, and this is the practical level. The ecumenical movement has been founded on several pillars: theological dialogue, developments of ecumenical spirituality, pray together, and also joint action around shared operational objectives, and the creation of organizations for ecumenical cooperation, such as the Conference of European Churches I am chairing. Ecumenical cooperation around common operation objective is often easier to achieve and more realistic than a doctrine agreement. It is said that doctrine divides and action unites. You mentioned that. So instead of stumbling over doctrinal questions which are often difficult to resolve or sometimes even insoluble, some prefer to identify concrete challenges and thus work together for peace, justice, and safeguard of creation. The history of KEC, the Conference of European Churches, an organization for ecumenical cooperation, which reflects a kind of structured ecumenism on action and service, shows time and again that common action can bring about a feeling of brotherhood and friendship between people of different churches beyond their diversity, and thus foster mutual understanding and a certain real appreciation of the other. It can sometimes facilitate theological dialogues. And recently, KEC and the Commission of the Bishop Conferences have strengthened their cooperation in order to enhance the credibility of their work with the European institution. And thanks to that strategy, the dialogue has been established at a higher level, a higher political level, with the different bodies of the EU, such as the Parliament, the Commission, or the rotating Presidency. And this experience not only encouraged the churches, but also religions and interfaith movement to develop bodies with a high level of representativeness. Ecumenical cooperation should therefore be pursued, and efforts should be made to find a common voice, although it should be realistically seen that in some points we are not able to reach a common voice. But this high level of representativeness is very essential to act on a social and political level. And then come to my last point, which is the pinnacle of ecumenism nowadays, receptive ecumenism. I am now on the level of a personal attitude. Rather than looking for what the other church lacks in order to become the truly Church of Jesus Christ, as I understand it. The question of receptive ecumenism is, what can I learn from the other church so that I can be more like the Church of Jesus Christ? Receptive ecumenism is based on the conviction that the substantial progress towards the full unity of the Church presupposes that everyone undergoes a conversion and thus enter in an attitude to listen and to learn from the other. For it is easier to change oneself than to change the other. In this, receptive ecumenism requires a radical change of attitude. It is no longer the question of explaining or asserting the relevance of one's own tradition, nor of seeking another's recognition of it, but of listening to this other, in order to try to hear and to discern in him, in her, that which can be nourished and deepen my own spiritual approach. It is a question of receiving the gift of the other, to say that the other church tradition has something important, even essential, to teach me, is the pinnacle of ecumenical movement at the moment. Although, by concluding now, Christian ecumenism has sometimes shown its limits, perhaps developed approaches that have in time proved insufficiency or even dead ends, it seems to me that these 4 lessons mentioned, namely the relationship to the truth, the union through diversity, reconciled diversity, the ecumenism structured on action and service, and receptive ecumenism are worthy to reflect on and to meditate. Thank you very much.
We thank you, President Krieger. Thank you very much. Time to listen, time to open to each other. And last but not least, Ioan Sauca, his General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. Floor is yours, and please forgive me, I have to go to take a train very soon, and I leave my colleague alone, but he's very good, as you have listened. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to answer the question with 3 answers. The first, if the question is Christian ecumenism a model, is raised in relationship to the developments within Christianity and among Christian churches, then my answer is yes. Christian ecumenism is a model for Christian communities that find themselves in a relationship of indifference, conflict, or competition with each other. I speak about Christian ecumenism as a model, indeed as an imperative for Christians and churches, because according to the scriptures we read, this is God's will in Christ for the unity and reconciliation of all. Furthermore, Christ himself, before crucifixion, prayed that all may be one, that the world may believe. Ecumenism is not therefore a choice, but an imperative, an obligation for the churches, despite or because of the counter-witness of their long-standing divisions. Churches have lived for centuries in isolation or in conflict. Only in the last century have many of them agreed to begin addressing together the causes of the separation. Divisions among Christians impact negatively their witness in the world and the very credibility of the churches. But we still have a long way to go on the ecumenical road. And I insisted on that because in our days, some churches are questioning the meaning of ecumenism, or some even refuse to use the word ecumenical as a dirty, filthy word. Theological agreements have been achieved on many of the age-old sensitive topics, yet work has to continue on other topics which will still need reflection and debate on the way towards full unity in faith. However, since the last WCC assembly in Busan, a new ecumenical paradigm has been adopted and this has been embraced by the majority of the churches, namely the common pilgrimage. I don't want to dilute the importance of theological dialogue, and our colleagues have mentioned them. But still we ask the question, can we go on with these theological dialogues, or we must find another theological paradigm? And this was found now, the pilgrimage. WCC say pilgrimage, Pope Francis said common journey. And this has been adopted also by the Ecumenical Patriarch, is a paradigm adopted by many churches. That is despite of the fact that we did not agree theologically on everything. We have committed ourselves to walk, to pray, and to work together rather than alone and in separation. And on the way, moving together, there is a more chance to better know one another and grow into fellowship and understanding. Now I tell you something which is against myself. I'm a dogmatic theologian and I very much insist on unity in faith. And I still believe that unless we discover our unity in the apostolic faith, we cannot move on. Otherwise, there will be negotiation among our divisions. Still, our common unity in the apostolic faith. Yet, Pope Francis visited Geneva, and we had a lunch together, and somebody asked, Holy Father, do you think there is any advancement in theological dialogue? And he said, yes, by God's grace, this will move on. But I tell you something. If you wait for theologians to agree, I tell you that they have some points to disagree even after the second coming of Jesus. So better let's move together and walk together on common values that we all witness. And this is with Christians, but also with non-Christians. So this is ecumenism of common values that we witness together, responding to the challenges of the world. Second point, if the question is a Christian ecumenism model is raised in relation to other faiths, such as Islam, for instance, then my answer is absolutely no. First, because Christian ecumenism emerges in response to ecclesial divisions within Christianity or to other forms of division that affect the churches. The fact that other faiths exhibit within themselves a diversity of streams or traditions or even conflicts comparable to those that characterize Christianity does not mean necessarily that they should address their relationship in the same way as Christianity does through ecumenical dialogue. And our personal opinion, we are called to witness with courage and humility to our faith. And let God do God's mission in the world. God is the only one who can change hearts. God is the source. God is the great teacher. God is the one who converts. Therefore, in deep humility, we have to intentionally refrain from arrogantly prescribing to others the medicine of unity that we did not fully reach for ourselves. The third and the last point. If the question is ecumenical, Christian ecumenism model is raised in a practical way in relation to the central theme of this year's G20 Interfaith Forum, namely a time to heal, then it is possible to say that the values, virtues, and principles that undergird Christian ecumenism are shared by other faiths and should be the basis for interfaith solidarity which seek the vulnerable and the oppressed regardless of their religious belonging. And then I come to the same idea of pilgrimage together on common values. And I give one few examples. 1 year ago, the World Council of Churches and the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue published together ecumenically a timely and meaningful response to the pandemic, calling for interreligious solidarity in the service of a wounded world. And I quote the document, Serving a Wounded World in Interreligious Solidarity. This was followed in December 2020 by a joint initiative with the World Jewish Congress, in which we jointly invited religious leaders of all traditions and places to reflect on and engage in ethical issues related to global vaccine distribution. Just another parenthesis, I've been in the ecumenical movement for 25 years. Even in interreligious dialogue, in the beginning, we insisted on comparative theologies. What do they say about God? What do we say? Nobody's interested in that anymore. Our Jewish or Muslims or Buddhists, they are not interested in comparative theologies with the WCC. What can we say together on common values, responding to the challenges of the world today? And this is very important all over. In a global context in which the pandemic has catalyzed inequalities and injustices, our Christian faith calls us to interreligious solidarity in this time of healing. A solidarity sustained by hope, nurtured by widely shared ethical and spiritual values, such as the unity of the human family. And we speak about human family, theologically, biblically, and guided by principles such as humility and vulnerability, respect, community, compassion and common good, dialogue and mutual learning, repentance and renewal, gratitude and generosity, and love. The ecumenical calling extends to encompass our economic relations with each other. As well, of vital importance is this time of climate emergency, our relationship with the environment, God's creation, of which are all part. So when I said in the beginning, unity of all, is not only unity of humanity only, but unity of the whole of creation and of the whole of realities. This is what is the heart of ecumenical movement. Semantically, ecumenism shares a common root with economics and ecology, the ancient Greek notion of the household, oikos. All three disciplines are concerned with the ordering of the household and its resources, financial, environmental, and moral and spiritual. The economic and the ecological and the moral are deeply intertwined and cannot be considered separately. So it's not only unity in faith and praying together. It's how we reflect our unity towards creation, towards ecology, towards economics. The season of creation, which we celebrate on 1st of September to 4th October, is an important ecumenical milestone for hope and healing. In 1989, Patriarch Dimitrios I declared 1st of September as a day of prayer for the care of creation, and today many churches from a wide variety of traditions observe the season of creation to join prayer, reflection, and action. And the theme for this year is a home for all, renewing the oikos of God. Now, just to conclude, the pandemic, rising levels of poverty and inequality, and the climate crisis teaches us vividly of the ecumenical dimensions of the oikos, of our shared vulnerability and shared faith as one humanity. We now feel more keenly and the fragility of human life, indeed of all life on this planet. These global challenges have revealed or reinforced not only our shared vulnerability, but also our fundamental community as humans, our solidarity across divides and borders, and our capacity for empathy, understanding, and sacrifice. And increasingly, we find that our shared faith commitment, however differently conceived, and shared values draw us closer ties and collaboration with other religious traditions in cooperative work for urgent climate action, for economic justice, and for basic human rights. We insisted on that because we asked the question, how do we relate this question of ecumenism to the theme of the G20? How do they fit together? And I think they fit perfectly, because this is the common root and common concern. The ecumenical impulse is fundamentally to seek common ground among various perspectives and traditions. It is an impulse that addresses the need for Christians and churches to grow in their real, though imperfect, koinonia, and at the same time engages Christianity side by side with other faiths in the path of healing and reconciliation with each other and with creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sauca. Thank you to the other honorable speakers of this session. Before starting the debate, let me say that the G20 Forum and the Foundation in particular, the host institution, is proud to have in this moment, in this session, so many personalities involved in the ecumenical dialogue, in the ecumenical activity. It's the first time for me, for many of us, that working in FSCIRE, in the Foundation for Religious Studies, this encounter with subject that we usually study, and we are proud to have you now in this session. So we heard many points of view, sometimes critical but constructive, I would say. And I would start the debate with another question. That's my job, or maybe my limit. And I will try to say that we have spoken many times of models of unity, reconciled diversity, theological agreements. So the search of the commonalities of what is in common among the churches. But that's something about what spoke Dr. Sauca. That's this common pilgrimage toward something, and the idea of the protection of environment and the protection of oikos, of the economy, the protection of the world, not as the protection of the Eden, but the protection of the place where will take place the eschatological fulfillment. And that's something we can share, maybe. The Christian ecumenism can share with the interfaith dialogue. That's something that the faith, the faith can discuss about this, about the protection of the environment, about this common pilgrimage, about the environment as the place of the eschatological fulfillment. That's my thoughts. So, as I said, we heard different points of view, so I think that we have enough material for the discussion. So, or question? It's late. What time is it? No, sorry. It was a so beautiful session that. But good. Thank you once again to our speakers, and thank you to the attendees, and I wish you a good continuation of this G20 forum. Thank you.